The tourism and hospitality industry has suffered for years of many cases of harassment in the workplace. It's come from co-workers, employers and users and guests alike. We have found that the younger people in the workplace tend to fall prey to these kinds of harassment in their first times working. So we've decided to have a new segment on harassment. We've come here today with Warren from the Anti-Discrimination Commission Queensland to talk about this subject. Warren, what is it that you exactly do here?
I'm a Community Relations Officer with the Anti-Discrimination Commission. My role is to basically educate the state of Queensland in relation to discrimination law, harassment laws, human rights laws. So the Commission has a two-tier function, one to handle complaints, the other to educate the community. I form in that stream.
Okay, so what exactly do you think, what is harassment?
Well, there's a number of different forms of harassment, and of course not all harassment is necessarily unlawful. It might be unfair and inappropriate. Human rights law covers sexual harassment and unlawful discrimination, some forms of vilification. Workplace harassment may fall under the Discrimination Act. It depends on whether it falls in the area of unlawful discrimination or sexual harassment.
So the circumstances in each case?
Well, I guess looking at unlawful discrimination, you'd need to come under a ground or an attribute. If we're looking at sexual harassment, it has a very specific definition. The definition of it is it's a very simple definition. Basically, in a nutshell, it's unwelcome behaviour of a sexual nature, generally in relation to you, that a reasonable person would assume that you would have been offended by.
So let's put this into an example. For example, if I was a man or a woman at work and I walk past the chef and he slaps my backside, would this be considered sexual harassment?
Okay. First off, we need to identify that you actually felt that that was unwelcome. If you did, of course, we've covered the first criteria, it's unwelcome. Then we need to find out whether it's a behaviour of a sexual nature. Patting someone on the bottom probably would be. We've then got to look at, okay, would a reasonable person assume that you would have been offended by that? Now, if your behaviour is totally appropriate, where you don't go around slapping people on the backside, well then a reasonable person is going to assume that you would have been offended by that. On the other hand, let's say you're also somebody who walks around and pats people on the backside, and then someone pats you on the backside, well a reasonable person would probably say, well get over it, okay, you do it.
So it has to be reasonable.
It has to be reasonable,
okay.
Yeah.
So well, when we're talking about that, does it matter whether it's a man or a woman?
No. There's a bit of a myth that sexual harassment is all about males preying on women, and certainly the case law that we have, the amount of complaints we get in would indicate that it is a major problem that certainly faces women. Certainly we also get a fair share of cases here though where males are sexually harassed by males, and I guess the myth around that is that it's quite often gay men that prey on other men, which of course that's totally wrong. Yeah. In my role, although I'm a Community Relations Officer, I was an investigator, conciliator here with the Commission for near on 9 years prior to that. I'm well aware that most of the male-on-male sexual harassment, the male harasser identifies as heterosexual. So it's about people getting into stupid, disgusting behaviour that goes too far.
So when we're talking about this harassment, say we had the example of me before, if I did not feel that that was sexual harassment and I didn't file a complaint, but one of the other workers thought it was very unreasonable, would they be able to claim as sexual harassment, or is it the person who's getting touched that has to? Okay,
there's some debate around at the moment in that the behaviour has to be in relation to you, for you to lodge a complaint. Of course, that is open to some level of interpretation. What is in relation to you? Of course, let's say that does happen to you, somebody does that to you, and I'm in the same environment, I probably wouldn't appreciate watching that happen. If I could prove or argue that I found it unwelcome, that it was of a sexual nature and that a reasonable person would assume that I could have been offended by that, well, it's in. I think there are still some grey areas in relation to sexual harassment, so behaviours like that you would need to be very careful with.
So this grey area, is there a certain line that has to be crossed, do you think?
The line that has to be crossed is really about reasonableness, and of course the question then of course is what's reasonable. If we look at it, reasonable is not that difficult to really identify.
Do we have to go to the courts before we can define reasonable, or can we do it ourselves?
Okay. With the Commission, I guess there's two tiers of how we resolve disputes once they're lodged. Conciliation is where we do it behind closed doors, where we bring people together to talk about the issue and see if they can resolve it between themselves. If they can resolve it between themselves at conciliation, the Commission won't be deciding whether it's sexual harassment or not. If they can't decide it, if they can't come to some resolution in a closed conference, the complainant, the one who's lodged the complaint, will be given the option to refer it to the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal. Tribunal at the end of the day may very well run a hearing, and it'll be the tribunal that will decide whether it's sexual harassment or not. They will do that based on that criteria of unwelcome sexual nature. Would a reasonable person assume you could have been offended? So
between sitting in the room and when it actually happens, what steps would you take?
Okay, there's a number of steps you can do if you are sexually harassed. I guess you need to weigh up as to what you actually want to do. Sometimes, of course, a first option for anybody in any of these issues is that they do nothing. Okay, you need to weigh that up though. Sexual harassment, I guess not addressed, usually continues.
Is it okay to do nothing?
Not particularly. As a human rights advocate, I'm going to say no. I'm well aware, though, that it can at times take some courage to lodge complaints and to take a grievance against certain employers. We would suggest that, okay, in the first instance, if you can, you could speak to the person and tell them that it's not wanted and please don't do it again. If they don't take that up, if they continue to do it or they treat you even worse, then you could go to a manager, supervisor, team leader, speak to them about it. If that does no good, you could look to see whether the organisation has an internal grievance process and lodge a grievance. Failing that, you could certainly come to us as an external agency. You don't have to run down the list. You don't have to do all those steps that I just said. You may very well come straight to us if that's what you choose to do. So
when you're talking about going to your employer, what is your employer's responsibility?
Employers come under particular vicarious liability provisions where they may very well be liable for the actions of their employees or their agents through the course of work. So of course if, let's say I sexually harass you, then my employer could very well be liable for my behaviour. So basically where it sits is that they will probably sit right in the middle of the complaint as much as I will.
So employers today really have to make sure that they wipe out discrimination in the workplace.
Yeah, most definitely. There's plenty of case law out there now where, and it's very common that the actual employer is the one who is named in the complaint and who then is the one who faces paying the damages. This is civil law, it's not criminal law. People are not penalised, they are not convicted, they're not jailed. This is civil law where, okay, you are compensated for the suffering that you have suffered. It's usually what will happen is it may very well be the company that pays for that suffering. Plus, of course, their reputation. Cases that go through to a public hearing at the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal are public, as I said. So, depending on the issue, the media quite often will jump on it, and of course, the reputation of the company is at risk then as well.
Definitely, definitely. So what would be some of the detriments that people suffer from sexual harassment?
Okay. I guess it depends on the person and what they've actually faced. Some of the detriment to this can be extremely damaging and very debilitating. Of course, quite often people leave where they're working, so they've lost that level of employment. They have to find other employment.
They could waste whole opportunities for jobs that way.
They can actually lose careers. There's many cases where people have spent a lot of time building a career to be sexually harassed. Not build a career to be sexually harassed, but build a career, then be sexually harassed, and then leave that career and have to start all over again. Of course, it can go to the extremes. It can go to people feeling suicidal. It can people can stop eating. They can become withdrawn. It quite often will affect their personal, intimate relationships at home. I guess it can be extremely damaging in some cases, particularly if there's been some level of incidents that may have happened to them previous as well through their life. So we need to be very careful because of the damage that this stuff can cause.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today, Warren, and I'm sure that some people will now have the courage and the knowledge to speak up against sexual harassment. Tune into our next podcast, which is going to be about discrimination in the workplace, and then we're going to do one on workplace bullying. And if you have any questions or want to file a complaint, just go straight to ADCQ and they'll be happy to take care of that for you.